Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us here for this session, which is going to look at the relationship between inequality and democracy and what that means for supporting democracy in, by, or despite of G7 countries. We want to look at where money flows and how money fosters social inequalities and what that means for the democratic state that we live in. I wanted to start with a short quote that was made by Nicole Deitelhoff yesterday on a different panel. And she said, "We need to make democracy an attractive model again. At the moment, it's a club that is made out of bullies and double standards." So the question today is kind of how do we, if we look at inequality and democracy, how do we make it an attractive model again? I think we have, and if you ask different people, of course, you get very different answers. If you ask a political scientist, he will tell you more about institution. If you ask an economist, he will tell you more about economic structures. So I'm very happy that we have two speakers who come from different vantage points at this question. We're going to start, of course, as in every good discussion, with analysis. And then we are going to ask what can actually be done about it, or what is already done about it and can be replicated. So our two speakers, allow me to introduce them. You can see them right behind me. We've got with us Julia Cagé, who is joining us from Paris. Is that right, Julia? Yes, she is.
Yeah.
Wonderful. She is wearing, which I find very impressive, 4 different hats. She's an associate professor of economics in the Department of Economics at Sciences Po Paris. She's a research fellow at the Center for Economic and Policy Research. She is the co-director of a research group called Evaluation of Democracy of the Laboratory for Interdisciplinary Public Policy. And last but not least, she's a board member of Agence France Presse. And she looks in her research at media economics, at political participation, and at political attitudes. And if that were not enough, she also writes a lot of books. So I've got one book, a very heavy one, a nice and red one, that is called The Price of Democracy. And I'm sure she's going to tell us about this book and about her other work today. And then we've got Tessa Dooms with us, who's joining us from Johannesburg. Tessa is a sociologist, a development practitioner, and a political analyst. She's the director of Rivonia Circle, and I'm sure she's going to tell us about the work of Rivonia Circle herself in her own word, but it produces bold ideas and solutions, and it aims to foster ethical, modernizing leadership. She is, if you Google her, the first thing you will notice, she's very active on social media. So please follow her on Twitter if you don't already. If you do that, you find out why age should not be a factor of choosing a leader, for example. What is the debate around nation building and the South African flag. And what I found very interesting, you find a lot of wordles and quadrils on her tweet. So Tessa, thank you so much that you're with us today. We very much look forward to your work. I'm not going to give you 2 questions. I'm only going to ask you to tell us a story for about 10 minutes containing the words inequality, democracy, and G7, right? So that's the task at hand. I was saying already to the participants in the room, we have a relaxed session. We had a lot of sessions over these days with a lot of speakers. So this is 2 excellent speakers. So take your time, and everybody in the room, take your time and enjoy as well. Julia, over to you.
Okay, so thanks very much for this invitation, and I am very glad to be here to talk about inequality, democracy as part of the G7. So that's done. I was very happy to get the opportunity to have this discussion, and I'm going to try to summarize a little bit a number of points I raised in my book, The Price of Democracy, but also to try to insist on a number of solutions, because at the end of the day, perhaps what I'm going to tell you is going to make you feel kind of bad, but I'm an optimistic person, so I always think that we can do better, and there are like solutions that can be proposed. What I try to study is a crisis of democracy, the crisis of representation. And what I do in my work is that I link this crisis to what I call political inequality. And political inequality is something you would say that is closely related at the end of the day to the issue of economic inequality. This political inequality is partly driven by the fact that worldwide, and I'm going to enter into some details, we see that the higher your income, the higher your wealth, the more you tend to fund democracy, the more you tend to fund political parties, the more you tend to fund electoral campaigns. And this has consequences. And at the end of the day, if we look at the way democracy works today, it looks more like €1, 1 vote than $1, 1 vote. This is the case in a country like the US, where we know that plenty and like too much money is often spent on US politics. It was more than $3 billion during the last presidential campaign. But very often from the European point of view, we kind of use the US, as a counterexample and tend to think that, in the US, there is this issue of capture of the democratic game by the private interest. But in Europe, we are doing much better. Why are we doing much better in Europe? So it depends on the country. In France, we think that we are doing much better because there is cap on how much a candidate can spend during elections, and there is cap on how much someone can give to a political party or to an electoral campaign. This is also the case in a country like Spain. This has been the case recently in a country like Italy. In the UK, it's a little bit more complicated. In the UK, there is no cap on how much you can give, but there is a cap on how much candidates can spend during general elections. One of the things that really struck me when I was studying the funding of democracy a little bit all around the world, or to be more honest with respect to my work, I hope I will do that all over the world at some point. Now I am mostly focusing on Western democracies, more and more working also on Brazil and trying to work on India. But what really struck me is it was the case of Germany, because it turns out that in Germany, there is no limit on how much one can give to political parties or to electoral campaigns. There is no limit on how much one can spend as a candidate. And what is also striking in Germany compared to other countries like France or like Spain, for example, in recent years, is that both individual donors and corporations can contribute to the German political life. This is the bad side of Germany. There is one good thing in Germany compared to France, for example, is that at least in Germany there is transparency. So we know the identity of the donors, and we know which political parties they contribute to. Very often in a number of countries, I'm talking about Germany, but in fact, if you compare to other countries, Sweden is working much like Germany, and this is also the case in Norway. Very often the argument that is used is to say, at the end of the day, as long as we have transparency, we don't need to have limitation, because transparency can be seen as a way to fight against corruption, and in particular against quid pro quo corruption. So I'm going to fund your political party, I'm going to fund your campaign, and you are going to give me something in exchange. In France, we tend to use the reverse argument, say, we have strong cap on donations and expenditure, so we do not need transparency. Caps are enough. I think that neither caps nor transparency is sufficient. One of the things that I really document in my books, in fact, I document a number of points. And what is kind of really striking is that this holds in all the 12 countries I consider, independently of the rules in place as of today, even if some countries are doing better than others. The first thing that is really striking is that if you look in France, Canada, Spain, in the US, in Germany, in the UK, if you look at the way democracy is funding, what you see is that donations to political parties are strongly associated with social class positions. So basically, the majority of the people, they do not give money to political parties. And if you look at the probability of giving and the average amount you give, you really see that this is an upper class phenomena. And this is more than an upper class phenomena. In France, I look at it by using fiscal data, and you see that everything is happening within the top 0.01% of the income distribution. So talking about the link between, you know, economic inequality and political inequality, we see this very strong relationship. And you see that only the very top of the distribution stands to contribute to the political life. This is the case also. In fact, if you look at the concentration of the donations in Germany, and you see the same kind of thing in the UK. What are the consequences of that? The first consequences is that, you know, this money do not benefit all the political parties the same way. In fact, and you see that also when you do like international comparisons, it tends to benefit mostly right-wing or like pro-business political parties in all the different countries. So it means that pro-business parties have an advantage compared to other parties, but it also means that those parties that are supposed to be more left-wing or, let's say, redistributive parties, at the end of the day, they're trying to fight with a pro-business party to get money to fund their campaign. And this can have very negative consequences because, you know, okay, you gave me like 10 minutes, so I'm going to say like too many things. It would be a little bit imprecise in 10 minutes. But at the end of the day, what you can document is that this idea, you know, very often people say, but you know, the left-wing parties, SPD in Germany, or like the New Labour in the UK, or the Partito Democratico in Italy, or in fact in France, this is like all the Macron phenomena come from the fact that the left is no longer like trying to fight on reducing inequality, but more on like social issue, like abortion, gay marriage. And on inequality, you know, they are happy, let's say, to be pro-business the same way as the right-wing party. And this might be partly linked to the fact that they need to raise money, and those who have the money to fund them are pro-business citizens that are going to encourage them not to increase too much progressive taxation, but rather to have like a more, let's say, liberal labor market. So this is the first consequences. And one of the things that always struck me when I was working with the German data, so what is cool with German data is that we have transparency. So we have everything, you know, we have the name of the donors. In particular, we have the name of the firm, company who make donations. You have the date and you have the recipient. And, you know, in Germany, you have a number of firms, for example, in the car industry, that tends to fund all the different political parties the same day. So, you know, they're going to give like 100,000 euros to SPD and 100,000 euros to CDU the exact same day. I'm going to ask me why. You know, when you go and vote, you don't vote for CDU and SPD at the same time. In fact, it means that at the end of the day, you do not really care about politics. You care about buying an insurance policy. You want to be sure, you know, that whoever is going to be elected, your industry is not going to suffer too much from regulation. So I'm summarizing everything very quickly, but I think this pro-business bias of donors is harmful for democracy. The second thing that I want to highlight, to be quick, is that at the end of the day, this unequal funding of democracy partly drives the crisis of representation. I want here to recommend you the work of two great political scientists in the US, Martin Gillands and Ben Page. What did they do? What they have done in the US is that they have looked at whether politicians tend to implement the policies favored by the citizens. So they have used, you know, like 50, 60 years of survey data, when on every different questions, it can be like on a minimum taxation, a war in Iraq, abortion, on all the different topics, you know, they use survey data when you know whether or not citizens they favor a policy, and then they look at the policy actually implemented. What they find is that on average, you know, if you look at the survey data and at the policy implemented, you see that politicians on average, they tend to implement the policies that are favored by the citizens. And then what they say that, okay, but let's look at what is happening when the preferences of the poor and the middle class diverge from the preferences of the rich. And what they see is that when a policy is favored by the rich, but not by the poor and the middle class, the governments are always going to implement this policy. And what they conclude, and something that perhaps this is my old reading of their book, is to say that, you know, for the past 50 or 60 years, it turns out that democracy has worked because by coincidence, on average, the preferences of the poor and of the middle class were the same than the preferences of the rich. And I think what we see today with increasing economic inequality, we see that there is a crisis of democracy because more and more and more and more, there is a divergence between the preferences of the poor and the preferences of the rich. And I think that with the climate change, you know, and the fact that we ask poor people to make, first of all, the fact that poor people worldwide are those that are suffering the more from the climate change. And that even within country, you see that poor people, they suffer more from the climate change than rich people. But at the end of the day, you know, you have Elon Musk and other billionaires that decides to go on march. I think, you know, this is really the symbol of this increasing divergence in preferences between the poor and the rich. So just to conclude, I think we can do things. If there is an issue of a crisis of democracy that is linked to the question of the funding of democracy, what we should do is better regulate private funding and fund partly democracy with public money. What does it mean better regulate private funding? I think it means that we should cap private donations to parties and campaigns at much lower levels than what they are actually. So in Germany, there is no cap, so we should introduce cap. But even in a country like France, when you have a cap at like 7,500 euros, for example, we should decrease this cap, and I propose like $200 or 200 euros per individual and per year. I say 200, you know, it can be like 150 or 250, you know, I'm not like crazy about this 200 number, but I really think that we need to have a very low cap. Second, in countries where it is not the case yet, I think we should really forbid donations by corporations for sure. But then the question is, how do you pay for democracy? Because democracy has a cost, and this is a good thing that democracy has a cost. You know, you want people to campaign, you want politicians, you know, to organize meetings, to go and meet citizens. So if you don't want it to be captured by private money, you need to have some public funding. And I think that we need to introduce a public funding system of elections that is dynamic and equal. What does it mean? Dynamic. First, the main issue you have today with all the systems in a number of countries in terms of public funding is that very often this is a result of the past election. So it's going to be frozen by like 4 or 5 years interval. But the democratic life, you know, is no longer frozen by 4 or 5 years interval. So you need to have it dynamic. So I propose an annual funding of democracy. And equal, it has to be equal because you want to spend the same amount of public money for every citizen independently of their income and wealth. So this is what I have called the democratic equality vouchers. You give each citizen each year a voucher equal €7 in my proposal that it can allocate to all the political parties and movement of his choice. This is also going to have the advantage, you know, to reconcile citizens with political parties, with political movements, with this like annual relationship, let's say. And this has also the advantage that both the parties in power and the opposition will have, you know, to go and argue to make counter proposal to convince citizens that they should fund their movement. Okay, and I guess I'm a little bit out of time, so I'm happy to listen to Tessa.
No, that was great. As we said, you know, we can be relaxed. Thank you so much for this ride through your ideas. I think later discussion, I would also like to go into the other proposal you have in your book, which I find also very interesting, on social representation in Parliament to create a permanent democracy, as you were saying, right? And also the question where your suggestions of democratic vouchers has already been tried to be implemented and whether it's worked or not, right? But we can go to that in the discussion. For now, I would like to give the floor to Tessa. Tessa, I imagine you're going to tackle the nexus between inequality and democracy from a very different point. So over to you. We're looking forward to your elaborations.
Thank you so much. I hope that there's not too much background noise. Great. So I'm really glad that Julia went first, because I think Julia paints a very, very grim picture around what the nexus between political elites and economic elites leads to. And she's talking about that in the context of countries that are in a relatively better position than developing countries, and a country like South Africa, which is the most unequal in the world. And so if we take that context And that becomes the context where though the G7 countries are seen very much as the model for democracy, it is the benchmark against which the rest of the world is modeled, and we're measured by how much and how close we are to democratic models in countries like the G7 countries. If you take those problems that exist there and you then superimpose them on my context in South Africa and African countries, developing countries, more unequal countries, you end up with a much more dire situation. And I want to describe what that dire situation looks like, give a sense of why it should matter to more developed countries, what happens and what the imports are in developing countries, and then give a sense of a few proposals. The first thing is that I come from the country where in terms of Africa, we have been seen as the most recent beacon of democratic hope in the country. And the story of South Africa is this mythology of democracy coming in, ensuring that there was a so-called bloodless revolution. And we have, we've just championed the right kind of policies, the right kind of constitution, the best constitution in the world, some might say. And it's in that context that we are having a decline in people's faith in democracy and willingness to participate. It is in that context that less than 30 years since the advent of democracy in South Africa, we are now at a point that less than a third of eligible voters are willing to show up to the polls. I think that is a dramatic decrease when you think about where South Africa was and where we've been. Even in the first 10 years of our democracy, we've just seen a plummeting of people's participation at the polls. But more worrying than whether people are willing to show up and put an X down is that the people who are willing to show up are generally in two categories. There are people who are in upper middle class and wealthy brackets of society, and people who are either the political elites themselves or connected to political elites. Generally, that's where the hope for democracy still lies. Again, that nexus between political elites and economic elites. And the rest of society, increasingly young people in the country who are affected by 70% youth unemployment, who are affected by gross negligence in terms of service delivery, their basic human rights being violated, a crime rate that is the highest in the world when it comes to murder and rape. Those people are saying, we have been sold a dream. We've been sold a promise that has not delivered. That one of the key things democracy was meant to deliver on, the democracy that the West championed to us, that the rest of the developed world championed to us as the path towards our freedom, that has been sold to us, and it is not delivering on basic things, never mind delivering on the promise of a just and equitable society. And what that erodes is more than just a sentiment. It erodes people's understand or a belief in the entirety of the process, the entirety of the institutions, the entirety of the way government operates, and people start to reject it. And so we are starting to see in South Africa a rise in ground vigilante type groups. We're starting to see in South Africa a lot more protest that isn't just resisting the current party in power, but a protest that is resisting systems, that's resisting the government, that's resisting the entire institution, because there's a lack of faith in the institutions rather than just in one or another political party. And we must take that seriously. Where really some of that disillusionment lies is that South Africa comes from a history of apartheid. And apartheid was clearly a political and economic elite project, clearly. And now what has happened is we've taken those very same systems and we have just changed the skin color, the social positioning of the people who are in power, and the very same money that was funding apartheid is now funding democracy. That's where people are at right now. So I do work in Rivonia Circle on democracy building. We literally have a program called the Democracy Builder that is funded by the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung. And we go into communities and we discuss politics, we discuss democracy, we discuss what kinds of models of democracy people are interested in, why people are disaffected. And there are two stories I want to tell from that quickly. One was a young man who said to us when we asked, what does democracy mean and where are we in terms of our democratic project? He said, in the democracy we have, all that we get is the vote. People in power get democracy. We just get a vote, they get democracy. And who the they is political and economic elites. And so in a context like that, you cannot then ask people continuously to show up for a democracy they don't believe is theirs. But the second big question people keep asking us, and we're coming into this as a space for engagement, for democratization, for engagement. People ask, where's your money coming from? People are very sensitive to the fact that because we're the kind of unequal country that we are, I mean, the top 10% earners in our country, and I have to think about this in dollar terms, but are earning about $1,000 a month. That's what it takes to be the top 10% earner in South Africa. That means that if somebody is able to fund you in the millions, they're probably a very, very small group of people. And as Julia said, they're probably funding everyone, which means they don't care about values and principles and all of that. And they were probably funding the apartheid government too. That's where we are at. And so until people feel like they can have a real stake, they're not going to continue to participate in democracy. And where that lies, where that disjuncture lies, has a lot to do with money. And it has a lot to do with the fact that the people who are able to, and I call it a leisurely activity at this point, but able to actually take time out of their lives, go and find the resources, find the people, mobilize, do all of the things that it takes to build democratic action and build democratic movements. Those people have the right to buy power. They buy power. That's what has happened. Our democracy is now about buying power, and we have to break the back of that. So what are some of the suggestions for what I call democratizing democracy? How do we start democratizing democracy? I think one of the first things that we need to do, if we're truly going to get through this, is, as Julia said, we need to talk about how we're regulating funding. But I would take it a step further and add to what Julia's suggestions have been. That what we need to start encouraging is not only public funding through the state, because there's also mistrust with the state, but also public funding through civic society, through actual individuals, through people need to feel like there's a place where they're willing to put their own resources into that is a safe place for democracy to happen. And we need to have that sense that even small money can fund democracy, that you don't need big money to fund democracy. If I see something that I believe in, that I value, even my dollar can matter. Now, we could say the US is actually an experiment in this. And I think it's actually an interesting experiment in this because we have seen how the Obama campaign did that kind of small money push. I think the Trump campaign, although it wasn't about small money, it certainly was about people who felt disenfranchised, feeling like they can create the democratic structures that they wanted to push for. But we need to get people to feel like they can be more included, both in terms of how they fund it, but also how they grow democracy. The second thing that I want to put on is encouraging political action outside of political parties. That goes beyond how we fund politics to how we see and develop political culture. Right now, South Africa we're at a point where we have 325 registered political parties and over 1,000 registered independent candidates. When we go to our next election, that number is likely to rise. That means that people are starting to say they too want to get involved, but they're not opting into the big establishment politics. A lot of those things that are registered as political parties are actually community action groups and community forums and all sorts of different organizations who are saying we too want to contest power. And I think there's something about going in that direction that says, how do we start to legitimize civic action outside of political parties when those same people and those same groups want to challenge political power or participate in political power, whether that's at the polls or whether it's in forms of accountability. And then the final thing that I want to put on the table is funding civic participation. And in the same ways that there are definitely issues with political funding, there is issues with civic funding, and the same kinds of elite issues can come in. But I do think that if people are interested in really disrupting this unholy nexus between political and economic elites, one of the ways to do it is to fund people who need to get involved and need to get engaged as active citizens. Because in context of high poverty particularly, we take for granted that activism costs something. It costs people something. When people are already poor and disenfranchised, somebody needs to come by and say, we're going to support your efforts because we believe in democracy and even you have the right to participate. And so I'm really very keen on making sure that we start to fund particularly community-based action and community-based organizations so that poverty is not an inhibiting factor to people's democratic participation.
Great, Tessa. Thank you. So many questions popping up in my mind, right? I find it very interesting what you're saying of also funding, or not only funding, but encouraging civic action outside of political parties, the old established one. The question that I would then have is, how do you build alliances that gather a strength and a force to actually make change happen on a larger political level, right? But I'm going to stop my questions now. You too, and I think there are a few more colleagues out there in the Zoom room from South Africa. I know maybe we've got a colleague from Vienna joining us as well. You can only see me, which is a bit of a shame, I would say. So I would like to ask people in the audience who now have a question to actually come up here, sit on that nice chair next to me, the hot chair, as I call it, and ask your question. Who would like to come up? Absolutely. I think that one is working as well.
Yes, it is. Thank you very much. And thank you for two fantastic, oh, I can see you there. That's just nice. So two really, really fascinating presentations. My question is actually for Tessa. You paint a picture of South Africa being extremely unequal and a lot of people feeling sort of very disillusioned with democracy and not getting anything out of democracy. One sector that is notoriously very unequal in South Africa is your health system. I think, you know, half the health spend goes on 16% of the population in private insurance schemes, and the other half on 84% of the population in an underfunded public system. There are plans in South Africa to introduce a national health insurance system that would collapse these things together, but there are huge political fights over this, not surprisingly, like the United States. What do you think would be the potential for that delivering some type of democracy dividend? You know, were that successful to create a unified NHI scheme in South Africa? Do you think that that would go some ways to sort of helping people thinking, well, this is some tangible change. We are actually getting equitable health services now. And do you think there is the potential for the current government to push those reforms through, despite that great political opposition from the elite?
Thank you so much. Building question. Yeah, please go ahead. All right, can you turn, Sebastian, can you unpin Tessa and Julia for a second? And then we can see Sebastian, or you pin Sebastian, that's the other option. Oh yeah, there he is. Hello, Sebastian. Please go ahead.
Yeah, good afternoon, Sebastian from FES, and currently in South Africa. And my question, very briefly, after these excellent inputs, would be, what am I doing here? What am I doing here as a G7 funded, if you want, head of a G7 funded organization promoting democracy in South Africa? Well, you know part of the answer because it's like working with great minds like Tessa here in South Africa, obviously. But my question goes a bit deeper to what Tessa said about this suspicion of where does the money come from, and what does democracy promotion really mean in a post-colonially sensitive manner, given what you have said. Clearly it is not institution building. Clearly it's not mobilizing for better voter turnout. Clearly we need to address different issues, and to what extent can it really be successful unless we are also democratizing the international order, if you want, the multilateral system we are living in, that is determining a lot of the rules that make these inequalities persist on a global scale. So speaking amongst friends, I assume, I can't see you, but speaking amongst friends who I would suspect and share the same urge to promote democracy, citizen participation, how do we do this as G7 funded based organizations in these contexts, given these histories that and context that we have just been presented with? Thanks for allowing me to ask.
Thank you so much, Sebastian. Yeah, I think that's a question in other contexts where we work, but of course it's also applicable. The political foundation in Germany gets funding also in Germany, right? Which is dependent on the votes they get over a certain period of time. So you could connect that. Okay, we've got two more. I'm going to take two more questions. That's wonderful. Please do come on up. Oh yeah, first Remy and then you. Lovely.
Thank you very much. Thank you for two fantastic presentations. My name is Alexia Faust, and I work at the German Development Institute. And my research focuses on just energy transitions and political decision-making around those transitions. As we know, there are a variety of actors involved. And so I think what the literature really says on political inequality is that there are sort of three types. Representation, in other words, participation, inequality of voice, and inequality of treatment, which might be equated to discrimination. So I was wondering, Julia, whether there are any other forms of political inequality that you think are playing into the issue. How do you measure political inequality aside from voter turnout? And then I guess another question for both of you is that in terms of natural resource management and environmental governance, we are seeing sort of a more polycentric approach, many different actors involved. For example, in Germany, the Coal Commission was enacted so that a variety of different voices were represented in Germany's coal phase out. Now, despite this polycentricity and this variety of actors, it seems that there is still a broad disillusionment with the political process. So how do we address sort of political inequality, despite the fact that there seems to be sort of more actors involved, more spaces for civic representation, more fora to discuss trade-offs, etc.? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. And we take one more and then over again to our speakers. Welcome. Hello.
Thank you. I'm Christian von Haldenberg. I'm a colleague for Alexandria from the German Development Institute, actually, so this fits. Yes, so actually I have so many questions, but let me first start by saying I really enjoyed both presentations, as did my predecessors here on this hot chair. And I really want to say to Julia that it's great that you address the issue of political financing and financing of parties and elections, because it is very clear that this undermines not only the narrative, but the principles of equality that are always celebrated at election times, right? And you see this very clearly in the United States, where I think it was under the Bush administration, there was a ruling from the Supreme Court that basically deleted all types of caps and limits to political party financing and led us to a situation where this, I would say, is not actually doesn't qualify as a democracy, at least not without any adjectives. I would rather call it elitist pluralism, to use a term that was coined in the 1980s. But my question first is, would it be enough to look at party financing alone? I see the point of having caps and of having transparency. By the way, with regard to Germany, transparency is only applies to donations above 10,000 euros, if I'm not mistaken, which on the one hand means there is limited transparency, but on the other hand, it also means that is a lot of party financing that takes place below this threshold, actually. So the looking at only at the donations above 10,000 euros might not give you the full picture of how political parties are financed in Germany. But in general terms, let's think about a situation where you really and are able to push for a political decision that there is a cap on public financing of parties and elections, and there is full transparency. My question is, would that be enough? Because we are sitting here in the rooms of a political foundation, and although I'm very sympathetic to this political foundation, I have to say they do not only go and do good things in South Africa and around the world, but they also support the social democratic cause. So they are part of the system, as are so many other political collectivities below or along with parties that promote certain causes that may be very noble or less noble also, or that may be in line of very particular interests also. So we would have to think about democracy and about the democratic process, not only from an electoral participation perspective and from the perspective of how we elect our leaders and how candidates are selected by parties, but in a broader sense, how we participate in political processes that lead to public policies or to public decisions. And in this sense, I want to say it's not only crisis. There are also very interesting, invigorating moments of democracy, and many of them take place at the local level, in our cities, and also at the level of new social media. I'm not going to say that social media are the solution to all the problems. They are patently not. They are also part of the problems, but there is a lot of innovation and a lot of vigor and energy and taking place there. So it's not only crisis. And let me, okay, I stop here.
All right, I think that's quite a lot to take in for our two speakers. So we stop here and then we can continue afterwards. Thank you so much. So who would like to start answering some of these or commenting on some of these questions and comments? Julia, you'd like to?
I can take the very last one. First, like a technical detail about Germany. So in Germany, there is transparency above 10K, where you need to publish, and this is published on the website of the Bundestag, data on donations on, I think, like quarterly basis or something like that. But the political parties, in their annual account report, they also need to report all the donation data, if I am not wrong, but I 100% sure, I think like above 500 euros. So this is not in real time, but for the researchers or like any like media or journalists interested into these questions, like with a 1 or 2 years lag, in fact, you can study donations that are below the 10K. And the last thing is that in the account, you will have the total amount of donations received, plus you will be able to compute from the account the donations like above 500, and then you will have the donations above 10K from the transparency rules. So at the end of the day, what you can do, and what I did in my book, is that you can look at the different amount of donations and look at the share of the total donations represented by the donations above 10K or by the donations by corporations relative to the share of smaller donations. This said, I think that the reporting in real time in Germany could be improved a lot if you say everything in real time, like quarterly basis, or it can be like every 6 months on the Bundestag website or any other website above 200 euros. This is the case in the US. There are a number of issues in the US, but at least you have transparency above $200. This is also the case in the UK. With a threshold that is somehow higher than in the US, but not much higher. So it means that Germany can do much better also in terms of transparency. Now, is it enough to look at party financing alone? No. But there are two things I want to highlight. Positive things with respect to the political foundation in Germany. I think at least one thing that is good with respect to political foundations in Germany is that they are mainly funded by public money. And in fact, where in France, for example, we spend a lot of money to fund political parties, but not think tanks, at least in Germany, you have a lot of public funding to foundations that is linked to the results of the last election. So there is a little bit of transparency. In a number of countries, in fact, we say, okay, we need to regulate political money. So we need to regulate donations to political parties, but we forgot completely to regulate donations to any other non-profit organizations, knowing that these non-profit organizations can include a lot of think tanks that are completely like, in fact, driven by political considerations. And what is even worse is that very often when you give money to these non-profit organizations, at the end of the day, you benefit from some tax deduction. So you express political preferences, like with political donations, and you benefit from money that the government is going to give you back. So I think, I did not speak to that before, but I think we shouldn't use tax deductions for political donations in general. There is no reason why, in my view, the government, all the citizens should subsidize the political preferences of the rich through tax deductions for political donations, first thing. And second thing, I think we should regulate much better all the donations that are made to the so-called non-profit organization, because a lot of these non-profit organizations in the number of countries are to deal with political purposes. This is something I am studying carefully in the case of France for now, like looking at the political dimension of charitable giving. Of course, some part of charitable giving is really about like charities, but there is a lot about politics, and we should do a better job at regulating that. The other thing that, okay, we are not going to enter into that, because if not, I will be there like tomorrow morning. But I think the other dimension that we really need to regulate better is the media industry and the ownership of the media. Okay, because if you have a lot of money and you want to influence public debate, what do? Or either you fund directly the political parties, or you fund political foundations. You can also buy some like publishing houses, or you just buy a media. And in a number of countries, there is not enough regulation as to media ownership, and this can be another tool of influence that leads to increasing political inequality. Two other quick things. One, with respect to what Tessa just said, I think this idea of small donations in the US is very interesting. You mentioned Obama campaign. In fact, what is even more striking is what has been developed since 2004 that is called ActBlue. ActBlue is an app who allow donors to make like donations super easily. So you can basically like donate like $1 in a click. And this has led to a huge increase in the number of small donors in the US. Now you have more than 300 people who have made in recent years like small donations below $200 in the US. And the Republican parties that did not have until recently such an app created one in 2019 that is called WinRed. So even the Republicans, they realize that it might make sense, in fact, to rely on small money, small donations, rather than only on big donors. One of your colleagues, when asking, was mentioning the Citizens United decision by the Supreme Court. That is a very bad decision, but basically it makes it impossible as of today, and with the current Supreme Court, to regulate donations. But you can try to take the problem the other way around. You say, okay, we are not allowed to limit donations by large donors that wants to capture. So let's in fact like put more small money on top of it. So we are going to kill their large donations and give voice back to the citizen. To answer quickly the very first question I got on the different dimension of political inequality, of voice, of treatment, whatever, and this idea of turnout, everything was correct. There is one dimension I would like to add, is this issue of lack of democratic representation in a descriptive term. And here I am referring to the work that is for me like one of the most important work in recent decade in political science, to the work by Anna Pitkin, who was one of the first to talk about descriptive representation. The fact that if you look today at our MPs, they do not look like the rest of the population. So we have made a little bit of progress in terms of gender. Okay, you have like more women, but we have made no progress at all. In fact, the situation is worse now than 20 years ago in terms of the representation of, let's say, blue-collar worker, people from poor socio-educated background. If you look at who are the MPs are going to be lawyers, are going to be professors, they are going to be, white-collar workers. But basically, you have like no blue-collar workers among MPs in the UK, in France, in Germany, in the US. And this is a big issue, because this also explains the crisis of representation. This together with the economic inequality. The fact that you look at the parliament and there is nobody like you in the parliament. And so this feeling, of not being well represented it partly drives the crisis. And I think we should introduce a number of rules, the same way, you know, that we have introduced gender parity historically, using the law. You can say, okay, it will happen per se, but it was not happening per se, so we needed to change the law. We might need to think about it to have more social parity, in a sense, to have a better representation, you know, of the population as it looks like as of today.
Thank you so much, Julia. I could ask a lot of questions back to that, right? Again, where has it already been tried? What have been sort of the challenges if you try a more social representation? Yeah, what are the rules you set up, and has any country at all had a stab at this, right? Mexico, I hear, out of the audience. Is that right, Julia? Do you want to?
Yeah, but in fact, you have some, like one of the very first countries that tried to do something like that, in fact, was India. But India has done that by reserving some district for like a lower caste versus higher caste. I think we shouldn't do that by reserving some, and this has been studied by a number of social scientists. For example, Francesca Jonsenius, who is a Norwegian political scientist, that has written a book on that, and she has shown that it has a lot of like positive consequences. This has been done in a sense that, you know, very recently in Chile for the chamber that has been elected for the new constitution. They have imposed some rule, not only in terms of gender parity, but also in terms of social parity, to be sure to have a parliament that looks like the majority of the population. And apparently it seems to work pretty well. So, you know, we have a number of historical examples, and what we know from history is that it has worked pretty well from gender. So if it has worked pretty well for gender, I guess we can do also pretty well in terms of social representation.
Thank you so much, Julia. Tessa, you've got about 3 minutes, I'd give you, to answer 3 very good questions from Alexia, from Sebastian, and from Peter. Is it right? Absolute Bob. Absolutely. So we've got those 3 questions. Over to you, Tessa.
Yeah, hopefully I'll do them justice. So just on that question about the NHI, National Health Insurance. So there are actually quite a few public services that are in effect nationalized. If we have free basic education, for example, what unfortunately that hasn't translated into, the wealthy subsidizing the poor. In effect, the reason why we're now having a conversation about national health insurance, even though a large part of our fiscus is actually spent on health, is that on the one hand, you've had poor delivery of that health. So spending more money hasn't necessarily meant better services. So you've got a bigger question about political will and political leadership that you need to solve for if any of this is going to work. But secondly, you increasingly have, again, in the most unequal country in the world, people able to privatize services, privatize what the state should be able to do, and build effectively separate economies almost based on private resources and private services that actually should be public goods. The downside of this, and the reason why the NHI is so important and why these fights are so important, is that number one, there's less and less of a sense of solidarity and a sense of a shared need for development if people have successfully privatized public goods and created alternate systems. But the other issue that it's raised is that there's also less incentive for the state to work. Because now, like transport, that have developed because the state is not providing those private goods. And so there are actually people who will lose if the state does better. If the state is more efficient, there are people like my industry will fall apart. And so there's a lot of disincentives to actually getting this. The need to get it right goes beyond just the question about cross-subsidization. It actually is about whether there's will and interest and an incentive for a good working democracy and a state that delivers on public goods. I'm going to collapse the other things into one sentiment. That really what we want is to go beyond transparency towards accountability when it comes to funding. For me, transparency is great, knowing who the funders are, and that's whether you're funding in the public sector or whether you're funding in civil society. Knowing who the funders are is important. But there are two other things that are important. One is knowing what those people are putting that money down for. And there needs to be a lot more accountability about what you're buying when you fund things. When you put your money somewhere, what is the incentive that drives you? What's the thing that you are hoping to buy? If you're nondescript putting money down on the table, you're probably buying power. You're probably just buying the next favor that you need. In South Africa, we've got an issue around the tender system in government, and we know that many people are just buying their tenders. They're making sure that the government is going to give them more business going forward, all sorts of things. But I think knowing at least what people are funding and asking funders to be accountable, not just transparent, but accountable. There needs to be more public accountability to private money, to the private sector. And this may seem counterintuitive because it's private, but it's all part of the same system. So when we talk about that money is part of this ecosystem. It's part of the interests that make up this nation. And so when you're going to use public money or private money for public ends, there's a level of accountability that we need. And just the fact that you operate within this system and in this country and in the prescripts of this law means there must be a level to which you are accountable for more than just how much you give, but what it is that you're buying when you give that money. And
we're losing you, Tessa.
Unless we get to that point of beyond the point of just having bad money, we will get to the point where we have bad actors that can get away with things because they never are held accountable.
Absolutely. So I am the last thing that's keeping the group here from lunch. And you two probably from very important other things. We've got one comment in the chat, which I just don't want to ignore. What's that? Could we? Services, political participation making is part of the services provided by government. Privatization prevents the government from providing political participation in determining how the services or goods are provided and whether the manner the goods are serviced or delivered serves the public good. Yeah, I think that's very much in line with what we've discussed and what we've heard. If there is no very urgent wish to say a last word from the two of you, anything, Julia, Tessa? I'm not going to try.
Just say that I'm very glad that we had the opportunity to have this discussion. And I just want to conclude with what Tessa said at the very beginning, you know, like very often we try to present G7 countries as a model for the rest of the world. But I think that in particular in terms of democracy, but not only, but in particular in terms of democracy, there is a lot of things that we need to improve, a lot of, and I think we can also try to draw some lessons from what is happening in a number of other countries, and perhaps in South Africa and the rest in the future, you know, like some innovations will be done in terms of new democratic models, and we will have to draw lessons from these innovations.
Absolutely. I think that's also the sense here at the summit that the solutions cannot always be found in G7 countries anymore, or that there are a lot of problems we have to look at and tackle. And I think that was really, for me, really interesting and fruitful, the examples you gave on what works and what can be done differently. So I hope we can continue that exchange. Thank you so much to the two of you for taking the time, for being with us. Have a wonderful day. And to everybody in the room, thank you also for being with us, and have a wonderful lunch break. Thank you.